Welcome to the Westminster Tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robodebt Royal Commission. My name is Caroline Croser-Barlow. I am a recovering public servant, and I am on Narrandjeri land. Joining me today from Kaurna land is a fellow recovering public servant and Managing Director of Good Government Advisory, Danielle Elston.
Hello, Caroline.
And today, for our very first Ask a Secretary episode, we are joined by Mike Kaiser, most recently Director General of the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Queensland. Hi, Mike.
Hi. In this case, it's Ask a Former Secretary.
Well, interestingly, I suspect that's as close as we're ever going to get. But let's see.
Same with ministers. We've had a former minister, I think current, aren't always as keen. Could I also point out for international listeners that we do not have any uniformity as to the heads of our departments like you have in the UK and Canada and I think New Zealand, a lot of our international listeners. So the heads of our departments are called Chief Executive Officers, Secretaries, Director Generals. I don't think there's any more, but it does make it tricky by jurisdiction. So they're the boss of the agency, if that's any help to those from other Westminster countries.
Brilliant. So we put out a call for questions on LinkedIn, and we are very grateful for both the high volume and high quality of questions. Mike, I didn't do the best job of theming these up, so you're just going to have to kind of get them as they come. Dee and I will throw back and forth to each other. But I'm going to start with a lovely one that I think might, I wondered if someone had asked you this directly and now they were asking it to you. So they said, let's start with a compliment. Thank you for bringing this wonderfully insightful podcast to the world. Thank you, person who says it. My anonymous question for Mike is, what do you really think when junior members of the department reach out to you to seek career guidance or advice? What do you say to them, and what do you wish you could say?
First of all, I'm just always grateful and pleasantly surprised when junior members of the public service even approach me, because, I was the Director General of a couple of departments and also the head of the public service in Queensland. And so having someone even approach someone like that is a challenge for people. And it shouldn't be, Director Generals, Secretaries, Chief Executives, call them what you like, are really put up on a pedestal. And that's ridiculous because it limits our knowledge of what's going on in a department, and it just always made me feel terribly uncomfortable that people would treat you as some kind of a god. It was really weird. So first of all, if someone approached me from the depths of the department, I was always pleasantly surprised and grateful that they did. Look, I was the beneficiary of some great mentors in my career, people like Wayne Goss, Mike Quigley at NBN Co. Always had enormous amounts of time for me, not just when I worked with them, but also afterwards. So I like to the extent possible, pay that forward. And so, it wasn't always possible, but, I'd try to go and have a cup of coffee or take the person's call or follow them up on LinkedIn. And it wasn't, they didn't always want hours and hours and hours of your time. It might just be, a perspective on an issue that they're dealing with. And if you're interested in building cultures and kind of, continuing that chain of knowledge that we need to keep dragging through the public service, then leaders have got to be prepared to kind of impart some of what they've learnt over the years to more junior members of staff.
I love, I've heard you talk about how you use LinkedIn because it gives you intimacy at scale. And I love that idea of connecting really in a kind of much more informal and direct way with your peeps. But I note you avoided the question. What do you wish you could say, Mike? Come on.
Look, there's always things on your mind as the head of an agency about, your frustrations with the politicians you work at or the opposition or particularly challenging stakeholders. There's all kinds of things you'd like to unburden on to anyone who's dares get close enough to you. But nothing particular springs to mind.
Brilliant. All right, I'm going to ask one more question before throwing to Danielle. And this one comes from my beautiful cousin who may not wish to be named. But because it's Christmas time or the Christmas holidays, she had a brilliant question about the etiquette of gift giving between bosses and teams and bosses, particularly in the public service. What advice do you have to give to leaders like her who have gone through the humiliating cycle of both undergiving and then overgiving out of compensation for undergiving the years before?
Yeah, look, I think it's generally more trouble than it's worth. My own practice was always my own practice was always just to give a small token of appreciation to the people who worked in my office, the people who worked closest to me and supported me in a very direct way. But by and large, I think it's worth avoiding. And I didn't notice any particularly strong culture of kind of Christmas gift giving in the public service, and I think that's probably appropriate. It's more trouble than it's worth. That's my view.
Solid. Very solid.
I'm going to Christmas parties become a whole other level of, does the boss pay for wine? What does HR think of that? I remember in my first year back in the service, we were very, very financially tight at home, and now this amount of money sounds small, but again, it was quite a while ago. And the thing came round and we were going to lunch and it was $150 a head.
That's very expensive even now.
And I had ASO 2s and 3s in my team, and there was no consideration given for the idea that we went somewhere less swanky or anything else. So the gifts are a nightmare. And then what do we do when people talk about 1980s Christmas parties, where the department paid for the full Monty piss up and all of the various kind of assaults and whatever else that probably fell out of that. It's such a different world. But once you get past presents, you got to get to how you organise the party, or the lunch or the drinks and what's appropriate. So it's all a bit of a nightmare in some ways.
Yeah.
I'm really going to get a reputation in this podcast for being very grinchy about Christmas.
You are anti-Christmas.
One of these questions we've got, this next question we get a lot of the time, and I usually find it's from mid-ranking people. So I find that junior people work across departments as a part of practical practice, and seniors have kind of organised, secretaries meetings or whatever else. And then in the middle, there's this impenetrable silo band. And so the question that we got was for you, Mike, was why are the silos of government departments so impermeable, and how can we make them less so?
Well, the silos are actually a design feature of the Westminster system. When you go back a couple of centuries and look at the complexity of the world that gave us the Westminster system, they were dealing with nowhere near the complexity of the problems that modern society and economy are dealing with. And so, we're left with the great features of the Westminster system, but some of them aren't quite up to the challenge of the kinds of issues that we have to face these days. And so the design feature is the way the accountabilities work. As a Director General of a department, I'm accountable for what happens in my department. I'm not accountable for outcomes unless they're somehow wholly within the purview of my department. And yet most of the things that the government works on behalf of society don't fit neatly into silos. And so the biggest problems that you can nominate, youth crime, suicide, a whole bunch of things, there's no one actually accountable for them. So
bit of housing, bit of education, bit of health, bit of psychiatry, bit of this, bit of that, bit of everything.
Exactly. So I used to trot off to estimates is an accountability process in Queensland, and I would answer questions about my department. That's what I'm accountable for.
So you've expressed support for outcomes-based budgeting, and the question came with a dash really ? Talk to me about where you've seen that work, or what's it going to take to make it work. So how do you look at, as I said, mental health, which has drivers of, or not only of 5 parts of your government, but of the Commonwealth as well. So if you're in state government, then you've got income support, you might have NDIS, you might have veterans issues or whatever else. I mean, I recognise that you certainly to start off with it would have to be at one level of government, but talk to me about where you've seen that work, or what on earth it would take to make that work.
Look, I'm not suggesting it would be easy. In fact, it causes Treasury officials heart palpitations every time you raise it, because it's not, it wouldn't be easy, but I think it's doable and it has to be done. You look at an issue like youth crime, for example. So the education department plays a role in that in the early years. So does the health department in terms of mental health. The police definitely play a part. The justice department plays a part. The corrections department plays a part. So there's a horizontal value chain, if you like, that runs through departments as someone traverses this system. And yet the budget processes we run asks those individual agencies to bring forward propositions for resources in complete ignorance of what the other agencies are doing. And so all of those good ideas go up, half of them get funded, and you're left with a whole bunch of initiatives that do not line up across the departments in a genuine value chain. So if you were to ask any government in Australia at the moment, maybe around the Western world, how much would you be prepared to invest in solving youth crime? They would say a lot of money. In fact, we are already investing a lot of money, but no one's accountable for that outcome.
Yeah.
Everyone plays a little part in it. I'm a big fan of single point accountability. You have to be able to say to someone, you are accountable for getting this outcome. Here is your budget allocation. There are lots of people who have a responsibility to contribute to that outcome, but I'm holding you accountable, and here's the money. If they're not playing, come and see me.
I reckon that's the thing, isn't it? It's not actually that you're trying to, it's like that it's not about outcomes-based budgeting. It's about single points of accountability and then giving the authority to the person who has the accountability to get the other agencies to play nicely. That's the bit.
Well, the authority, the accountability and the authority, but then also the resources. And that's where the budgeting bit comes in. And so, the Queensland government, under an initiative called Advancing Queensland Priorities, many years ago, did begin down the path of, joined up budget bids. Sir Michael Barber in the UK, back in Blair's day, went down this path. I don't know if they got to outcomes budgeting, but I can tell you across the private sector, where I've done some work, and in a consultancy sense and also in the private sector, they fund outcomes. And they then align their organisation to those outcomes. They don't fund the silos and expect to get outcomes from them.
I love that.
And that's actually this is the question we received, but I'm actually going to broaden it because you mentioned what the private sector does. So the question was, from a listener, was how do you address conflict of interest concerns when moving from senior political advisory roles to senior public servant positions? But I would actually add, when moving also from the private sector to so from politics to the public service, or from the private sector, particularly after the last 18 months and what we've learned in various inquiries about how some of the big four consulting firms have behaved and worked, I think it's kind of a dual question, which is how do you address the conflict of interest concern when moving into the public service from either politics or the private sector?
Well, I'm a case in point for both, because I've got a political background and I was also a partner at KPMG before moving over to government. So I'm guilty on both fronts. But look, I think
it is guilty or a broad view of the world that helps create outcomes. But the challenge is it does create a layer that a public servant who comes in as a young person and stays there has a lot less. They might have their school board or something, but there's a lot less for them to manage in conflicts than there is when you have had a more varied career. And I have also had a more varied career than a regular public servant, and it is harder to manage conflicts of interest. So I don't think it's necessarily a failing. Sure. In fact, I think we need more mix in the cauldron. But how do you then manage the disadvantage that does come with that, or the risk? Well,
there's all kinds of. Well, there's obviously all the formal mechanisms that you go through. We have an integrity commissioner in Queensland, and when I was first made a Director General of the Resources Department, I went off to the integrity commissioner, as I was required to do, to explain my circumstances and my background as a KPMG partner working for the Queensland resources sector, to work through what my conflicts management plan would be.
How helpful. You got help doing that. Like they talked you through it? Okay. I thought this was like a good, helpful story.
The Integrity Commissioner's opening response to an explanation of my background was, I don't think you can be a Director General in the Queensland Government. So that was the starting point, but through a long series of conversations, we got to something that was much more workable. But look, I always bristle at the suggestion, particularly that because I have a political background, I haven't held a political role for now 15 years, 10 years when I went into the Queensland Public Service. I bristle at the suggestion that because I have politics in my background, I can't be a public servant. What I say to people who raise that accusation is, judge me on the way I behave and what I do, as opposed to what my background is. And I think particularly because I was hypersensitive to having that political background, I'd like to think I was an impeccable public servant in terms of my independence and impartiality in the advice I gave and the way that I managed the departments that I ran. So, I'm deeply respectful of the role public servants play, of the role political players play, of the role the private sector plays in society. And you can move between them as long as you know that the role you're playing has to change. And so when I became a public servant, I left behind those political traits. But bear in mind, voting is compulsory in Australia. And so every public servant is required by law to have a view about politics. That doesn't matter. What matters is what they do with that view while they're at work.
Absolutely.
Oh, I completely agree. And there are a number of former political staffers from both sides of politics who have made excellent senior public servants, some of whom have reflected to me that they've never felt properly trusted by all public servants, or that there's a culture of insiders and outsiders and insider and outsider views of the world. And again, like you, many ex-COSers go on to a bit of time in the private sector and then some time it becomes a series of different things. And this was not, this is not in the list of questions, but just as you were talking, like, what do you think of the culture of the public service in its welcoming or of views from the outside? So when people come in with different backgrounds, because I would say I would love a stat. I'd love to see this in a state of the sector, how many people have ever worked in a non-public sector job. But I would say it's a vast majority, or at least more a majority, have not had jobs outside of the service. And so when leaders come in, either from politics or the private sector or, anything complete, or from overseas, do you think in your time knocking around in different places over a long period of time, the public sector is very good at embracing them and their leadership, or do you think there are holdout quarters?
It varies, and there's a lot of things you need to be cautious about. I mean, it's not always a great thing when someone at a very senior level within the public service comes into the public service from outside the public service and doesn't embrace public service values and norms, for example. So you get these buffheads from the private sector who come into the public sector saying, well, I'm going to sort them out. I'm going to tell them a thing or two about the way to run an organisation. And, of course, they always fall on their face because they don't embrace the role the public service has to play. And I'm not saying there's not space for the public service to understand the approaches to efficiency and effectiveness and productivity that the private sector brings. But if you take that too far and break the culture and the mould and go beyond the role of the public service in doing that, that's what creates problems. So sometimes it's a success, sometimes it's not. I'm more interested in the role people play than their backgrounds necessarily. You have lifers in the public service who are brilliant public servants, and because of their curiosity, because of their scepticism, because they're willing to learn about other sectors, they make brilliant public servants. And then you get others who drift in and out who don't bring any of that to the role. So it's not background, it's how you approach the role, I think.
Yeah, when I first came back in, there was a little flurry of recruits from the private sector in Europe and the UK. And one of the things they were told on recruitment, because this is another part, what do you tell people from the outside when they're coming in? How are you doing that vetting and conversation process as a part of recruitment? Was that they were coming to fix it. So they turned up to a group of experienced public servants, I can think of 5 or 6 examples over a period in the early 2010s, where they came in and they were like, "You're slow, you're stupid, day 1, day 5.
Yeah.
Like, we do it like this over here. In the private sector, we do it like this. In the UK, we do it like that." And in a really shocking development, lifelong public servants who have been working their butts off for a long time all just kind of like put their chairs back and thought, "I'll just wait this out. This guy's not going to hang around for long."
Yeah.
Because it's about that approach. And I think that there is, I always caution people coming into the service at a senior level to do the listening tour. Like, if you come in on day 1 and unfurl you're all broken, I've got a plan to fix it, no one is going to help you. Not a soul is going to help you. You don't actually know what you're talking about.
Yep.
Yet.
And look, there's a great, here's a plug for a great initiative going on in Queensland at the moment between the University of Queensland and the Queensland Futures, an organisation, a think tank effectively called Queensland Futures. They've partnered to get middle-ranking public servants and middle-ranking business professionals together to help build an understanding across that interface. Because what the private sector doesn't understand is that when you're dealing with public money and you're developing policy, there is an obligation to take your time and consult the public and also all of the governance that's involved in spending taxpayers' dollars. They don't get that. But nor do public servants get that capital isn't patient and time is money, and the private sector naturally wants to go quickly, just for example. So this is a great initiative where they're taking people mid-career, putting them in a room together and trying to build that appreciation of the value of the different perspectives.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and it goes straight and beautifully to our next question, which was, can government truly and adequately respond to big picture and systemic change as demanded by the energy transition and the need to move to net zero?
Well, you'd be nuts if you didn't worry about that, because it's just such a wicked, multifaceted problem. There's simultaneously massive infrastructure investment required. There's social license that needs to be gained. There's working out what the appropriate private sector role is in all of that, because the private sector loves to talk about how they're entrepreneurial and take risk. But of course, when it involves investment in early technologies, they tend not to be, and they leave it to the public sector. So there's a lot of complexity in all of that. And you'd be crazy not to worry about that. But nothing, none of the problems that government is working on, including this one, get better with time. That's something I tried to remind public servants that I worked with. Whether it's the economic transition because of climate change, whether it's, dependency on government services, whether it's growing population and the pressures that puts on the environment, none of those things get better with time. And we have to just do our best, one foot in front of the other, to deal with them.
But I think what I'm hearing you say is there's also something about working with private industry and kind of trying to bring in those skill sets into government, which gets to this question of kind of how do we do that effectively in the public service? Like, how do we make proper use of bringing those skill sets in? Do you have any reflections on that?
Well, partnerships between government and the private sector come in many forms, but most of society and the economy's issues that are worth tackling need to be tackled by multiple government agencies, as we were saying before, but also an involvement by the private sector is often, really warranted. And energy transition is a classic example. But we have to get past, the us versus them nonsense and get to what the best respective roles are. Like I said before, the private sector loves to lord it over government about their entrepreneurship and their risk-taking, when in actual fact they're quite risk-averse.
Yes.
You look at an iPhone, all of the things that are great about this, the example I love to use, all of the things that are great about the iPhone, the touch screen, Siri, Wi-Fi connectivity, all of those things were begun with government investment They were actually begun by politicians and government taking risks with taxpayers' money to develop technologies that the private sector then capitalised on. So, the relationship's a complex one, but getting the partnership right on the big questions is very important. And that's why, that UQ Queensland Futures Initiative I talked about before is so important, because you have to start with those middle-ranking people in both sectors to build an appreciation of what each brings.
We were going to ask you about this in our other episode, but now there's the perfect opportunity. Can you tell the story of Leo Heischler? Have I saying that right?
Leo Hilscher.
Can you tell the story? I love this story.
He's he's my pin-up public servant from the 60s who I kind of use emblematically within the public service to talk about risk-taking and the role public servants should take with the private sector. So Leo Hilscher was a Treasury official in the 60s, wasn't the head of Treasury. I think he was a deputy. And Utah mining company from the United States, discovered coal resources in the Bowen Basin in Queensland, came to Queensland and said, we want to exploit these resources and we'd like, government's permission to do that. Leo Hilscher effectively negotiated the deal with them where he said, on behalf of government, well, you're going to need railway lines and ports, and we want to build them. We don't want you to build them. We want them to be public assets.
Yeah.
So we will borrow the money from you to build them, and then we will charge you an access fee and use that access fee to pay back the loan.
This is amazing.
So now, at this point in the story, I always say that's a PPP I can really get into. But, they got great value out of it.
Of course.
The public got great value out of it. The public interest was served because up and down the Queensland coast now, we have amazing railway lines and port facilities that are government-owned, owned by the people of Queensland, effectively paid for by a private company, eventually bought by BHP. I tell that story to talk about public sector entrepreneurship and our need to be capable of standing toe to toe, particularly with the private sector, to ensure that the public interest is served. You can tell in those negotiations when you read the history of it that Leo was single-mindedly focused on the public interest.
Yeah.
And that's an important lesson, I think, for public
servants. And
servants.
not cowed by them. Not like, oh, I'm just a public servant, what would I know? He was...
Exactly, and that happens all too often. Public servants can get starry-eyed when they're sitting across the table from the private sector. And in a lot of the portfolios I ran, which were essentially about economic development, we have a lot to do with the private sector. And it was always a bit tragic for me to hear or to sense in public servants a sense of inferiority.
Yeah.
Where what we're there to do is the noblest of things you can possibly do, and that is ensure progress, but do it so that the public interest is served.
Love it.
It's also interesting listening to that, how skills are developed in different departments, in the sense that I don't think inferiority to the publics to the private sector is felt in other parts of the government who don't do it very often. It's actually more of a complete fear of engaging. And a lot of that's about propriety. And, for government, the other huge part, you keep talking about the private sector, is the not-for-profit sector, which delivers huge amounts of what government either used to deliver or could have delivered over time.
Yep.
And this reticence and fear of... So I think that the authorising environment in contract management and what you're talking about is in some ways a little bit clearer, and the rules are a bit clearer. Whereas if you send mid-ranking public servants in to meet with a Red Cross or someone else and they've got an idea, no one's actually as sure how to commission it often and what the rules around that should be, because we have not given the same amount of thought, energy, training to not-for-profit commissioning, which when you say it like that, it sounds like a small part of government. It's bloody massive part of government.
All NDIS provision is commissioned through. Anyway.
Violence, community development, youth justice, anyway. In the community sector, government delivers less and less, and they pay the not-for-profit sector to deliver more and more. But whether who's inferior and who's not, but then the how you should engage is something that I really feel like there's a fear in public servants when I work with them, and sometimes do stakeholder facilitation between those groups and government. And government is a bit frightened because I don't know what they're allowed to commit to. Whereas I think when you're doing procurement for the South Road Corridor or in South Australia or building a hospital, the rules are actually a lot clearer. And so engagement with the private sector, I think, is a little bit more confident than it can be with the not-for-profit sector. Just a kind of off-to-the-side observation of how you describe that interaction being quite different to the interactions I observe with the NFP sector, or the for-purpose sector, as we're calling it, which I think is messier and less kind of structured than private sector procurement and partnerships. Sorry, tangent. The next question is about robo-debt from a listener, and the first bit's about tenure, so we'll put a pin in the first bit, but I'll read the whole question and comment from this listener because I want to talk about that later. I think a big part of what contributed to the robo-debt disaster was the magnitude of personal impacts that faced any public servant who challenged the status quo. Starting at the top, I think we need to have independent appointment of secretaries by a public service commissioner, as happens in New Zealand, rather than by governments of the day. Then we need to find better ways to protect whistleblowers from retribution or career-ending treatment. Public servants are typically well paid with job stability, which means they have likely taken on big mortgage debts, enrolled children in expensive schools, etc., all of which serve to make retaining their jobs their top priority. The environment that has been described in DHS and even DSS during the robo-debt years would have made it obvious that anyone speaking out faced either a job and or career loss. While we can expect leadership to create the culture of speaking up and listening to those voices, hard protections might serve to support people to speak out more readily. That said, I have no idea what those protections may look like.
Yeah.
Over to you.
So I think it is interesting. So they have mentioned kind of, yes, culture is important. People will speak up when the culture is good. But the question is really about, like, you can't always guarantee that. You can't always see it, smell it, know it as a government. So the hard protections around being able to speak up and what they could or should look like. What's your view, I suppose, in some ways, of not culture versus hard protections, but the role of hard protections in finding these kind of failures?
Well, the first thing to say, I suppose, is you'd hope to have a culture where you don't kind of need to codify protections for someone who just wants to draw to the attention of leadership something that's going on in the department. Unfortunately, you do, though, because, people against whom claims are lodged can display all kinds of human reaction to that circumstance. Look, as a public sector leader of agencies in Queensland, I spent an inordinate amount of time dealing with and managing or delegating, but keeping an eye on, in some circumstances, complaints that were made by whistleblowers. I don't know what it's like in other jurisdictions, but there didn't seem to be a lack of ability for people to come forward with their complaints, and they all were either referred to, in the Queensland case, the Crime and Corruption Commission, or to internal departmental bodies, sometimes to the CCC, who would say this is one you can deal with, or this is one you can deal with our oversight, or this one's serious enough for us to deal with. There didn't seem to be any shortage of there didn't seem to be any reticence, put it that way, on the part of public servants to go and lodge a formal complaint if they thought it was warranted. That's one observation. But in terms of the overall amount of time spent on that, there was a lot of it. But, 99.9% of the public service continues to rattle along just fine, completely unaffected by formal whistleblower complaints. And I think that there's, a point I'd like to make is there's integrity issues for that 99.9% too. I mean, how the public service deals with the public in policy development or service delivery is an integrity issue. And yet the integrity debate is captured by the 0.0001% of cases that actually involve wrongdoing. And so we get this narrow view of what integrity means in the public service. But for example, not, claiming that you're consulting the public when you have no intention of changing the decision that's already been made, is an integrity issue.
Yes.
And when people find out about it, it will shatter trust in the process.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, the whole integrity debate is focused so much on the pointy wrongdoing end at the expense of the broader integrity issues around things like our obligations to the public.
Oh, I 100% agree with that, and spend a lot of time in various things saying that we spend far too much time worrying about people with brown paper bags full of money, and I'm sorry to say that to a Queenslander, but it is rare. Like super, super, super rare, and we spend 99% of our time worried that it's happening, and then not spending any time worrying about all the things you just described. So, just our last question. We've talked about tenure on this podcast a lot, and we've talked about it with Andrew Podger. I am sometimes a skeptic about tenure at the very top of public services. And Andrew is very, very committed to it, both independent appointment via secretaries and tenure. We've had a couple of questions from listeners about how you can possibly give frank and fearless advice to the government of the day without tenure. And one listener even asked, is it harder to give good advice in an executive and non-tenured role than it is for like junior tenured people to be able to go up to a minister and give good advice? Noting it's probably still a bit too soon, but what is your view in general so far as a Westminster tradition? Like it doesn't happen in the UK, really. So what is your view about this shift that was made 20 years ago that I think happened probably without a lot of thought, but around tenure and secretaries and that kind of thing?
Yeah, look, 10 Directors General in Queensland just lost their jobs out of 18. And so you're quite right to point to the fact that it's become quite commonplace at the top of the public service for these roles to change. My own view is I've got a lot more sympathy for the heads of individual agencies than I do for the head of a central agency. Like in my case, I was the head of DPC, Department of the Premier and Cabinet, and I deeply respect an incoming Premier and an incoming government's right to choose in that role as head of the public service someone who they know can do a good, fair, impartial, professional job, but that they can have faith in will follow, their policy lead. I've got a bit more sympathy for individual Directors General in departments because I think that turnover has a really debilitating effect on the public service, as do machinery of government changes. It's not just sackings. It's also, I was in the Queensland Public Service for 4 years. I ran 3 different departments. Now, there's not one of those changes I said no to, and I enjoyed all of them. But that's a bit over the top, really. You just get your feet under the desk and start making some long-term reforms and changes to the culture of an organisation, and suddenly you're whipped off to another place. So it's not only tenure, it's also, machinery of government changes at the senior levels of the public service too that have a really debilitating effect. So the more stability you can provide at those senior levels in various ways is really important. The connection between tenure and advice giving, I don't know. I never felt a sense of tenure in the Queensland Public Service. I didn't assume that I had any. And I don't think it impacted on my advice giving. It may be different for others, but I think things like character and capability and training come into effect when it comes to boldness and frankness in advice giving too, not just tenure. So these are complex, nuanced issues, I suppose. One thing I would say, though, at every level of the public service is that it ought to be possible to lose your job. It ought to be possible to lose your job. If you've been incompetent or if you've been dishonest, then you ought to lose your job for that. And I think if we lose that basic tenet of employment, then I think, you get a very reckless, a public service that isn't serving the public interest.
I agree.
Okay, quick roundup question, just because it's like holiday season. Any kind of pod, reading, watching, recommendations you want to send off to our listeners? What should they, I mean, obviously, apart from us, what should they be listening to or reading? Or
Oh, well, I should say I highly recommend this podcast. I suppose the only people who will hear that are people who already listen, I guess.
It's fine. Cool.
But I do think it's absolutely wonderful that the podcast exists, and congratulations on it, because so much can be achieved in terms of public sector capability and integrity by just having this conversation, by people hearing people talk about these issues and absorbing the lessons from the past and the way the issues get presented. So I'd recommend your podcast. Unfortunately, only people who are listening to it will hear that recommendation. What am I reading? I'm having a reread of a terrific book called 9 Lies About Work. Which is 9 Lies About Work. It takes every HR bias and pulls it apart based on evidence and recommends what you should do instead. So it's a great book for leaders. I think its subtitle is A Free Thinking Leader's Guide to Leadership or something like that. So
the real world, and I only say that because I am literally Googling it whilst you're recommending
to the real world, that's right, yep. So it appeals to my contrarian aspects of my culture, of my character.
You are an
You'll love it,
excellent
Danielle.
recommender.
Caroline,
Yeah. Yep. I
Go
also
to
love
cart. You've lost me already. Go to cart. Proceed to checkout.
Brilliant. Look, thanks so much, Mike. It's been such a privilege to have this much of your time, and we really, really appreciate it, and look forward to maybe having another chat another day.
No worries. I have time to spare just at the moment. So.
Right.
Till next time.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions, or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.